Hello YouTube. Hi, my name is Mark and this is Nixon Motorsports. This channel is all about motorsports, from racing to exotic cars and even simulators. Today's video, we're going to talk about ride height and laser sensors for your race car. Okay, with that, let's get into it. Come on. All right, so we're going to talk about ride height, and I'm going to get into, well, what is that? I'm going to talk about why do you care, and more importantly, how you can measure ride height for your race car. Okay? So let me start with what is ride height. Now, look, most of you know this. In fact, probably all of you know, but just bear with me. Just let me explain very quickly. Ride height itself, it's nothing more than the measurement, the distance between the bottom of your race car and the road surface or track. Very, very simple, right? So I don't have my race car on the ground to be able to show you. I got it in pieces here. So today I'm going to be using this small little Ferrari diecast model, right? So when I talk about ride height itself, again, the distance from the bottom of the car, use my little fancy pointer here, the bottom of the car to the road surface itself. So that distance is ride height. Now, why is ride height important? Let me spend a minute talking about that. First of all, let me explain. Ride height, you actually have two dimensions. You have a static ride height and you have a dynamic ride height. And all I mean by that is static is when the car is not in motion. It's on a flat surface, and the dimensions of the ride height are fixed at that point. Again, the car is not in motion. And the opposite is true. If it's dynamic ride height, I'm referring to the car that's in motion. So it's on track, it's being driven, and the ride height dimensions while in motion is what I'm referring to when I talk about dynamic ride height. So ride height is actually a very important measurement for any performance car, race cars, of course. And let me spend a minute talking about that. And by the way, at the end of this video, I'll show you some of the data logged worksheets that I use and how I measure and then use ride height for my race car. Okay, so make sure you watch that. But back to the back to ride height itself, and again, why do you care? Well, let me start with this actually. Let me talk about CG. Many racers will say, well, what's your CG and so on, and that means center of gravity, by the way. I'm not going to get into it specifically and how you can measure or calculate your CG for your race car today, but I do want to talk about it because ride height actually makes a big difference in your CG for the race car. Now let me pan over here to this fancy little model that I have. So center of gravity for any particular race car. Think of it this way. If you had a string that was attached to the car at some point in the car, and if you pick it up from that specific point, if the car stays completely balanced, it doesn't tip forward, it doesn't tip backwards, it doesn't go side to side, that is your CG of the race car. And ride height makes a big impact on the CG of your race car. Again, that specific point where it's perfectly balanced. So ride height, let me talk about a couple examples. So first of, ride height is not typically the same dimension throughout the bottom of your floor of the race car to the road surface. Typically, you're going to have variation to that. But back on CG itself, so if you lowered the front of your race car, lowered it more than the rear of the race car, you actually will shift that CG, you'll actually shift the CG forward, right? So if you think of this here, if we lowered the front, and if the CG was here as an example, it would actually move the CG forward. Now, what does that do? It actually takes weight from the rear of your race car, and it actually shifts that weight to the front. And why would a racer want to do that as an example? Look, it's a fine-tuning tool. In that example I just gave you, lowering the front of the car more than the rear, shifting weight forward, you actually would provide more mechanical grip to the front of the race car. Let's say you had a slight understeer into corners and you were just trying to tune that out. One option is you could actually move the CG a little forward and actually help correct some of that understeer. That's just one example. The opposite is true as well. If you lower the rear of the race car more than the front, you'll actually shift the CG towards the rear. The same thing, you'll take weight from the front and you'll move that weight towards the rear of the race car. The same is true for side to side. So if the car is actually lower on one side versus the other, you actually would, again, move the CG that direction and move some amount of weight to the lower portion of the race car. Does that all make sense? So another example, if you lower the CG on your race car, typically that is a very positive thing. So the lower the CG is on the race car, moving more mass lower towards the road surface, it actually helps your cornering capability. And so most racers, most drivers will attempt to get their CG as low as possible. Now you got to keep in mind, it depends on the type of car, the race car you have and so on. If you have a race car that has very soft springs, as an example, it has a lot of body roll, it moves dramatically from side to side and cornering and so on, you know, ride height will change dramatically. So that CG will actually shift dramatically. And so that's one reason why, for an example, in rain setups, race cars typically will raise the car up higher, for a couple of reasons. To avoid, let's just say, standing water on the track. You don't want the bottom of the car aquaplaning, that kind of thing. But the other reason, if you soften the springs, you know, the car might have a lot more mechanical roll. And if you do that, if you think about it, when you're turning with a lot of body roll, you'll actually shift a lot of weight, because that CG will move towards the outside, towards the loaded tires, and actually help your grip from that point of view. So just a couple examples talking about why CG in the race car is so important, and then how ride height actually can influence and make a big difference in the CG for your race car. So other reasons of why ride height is so important, if you have a race car that is very low to the track, meaning the ride height, that dimension is very, very small, understanding your ride height is extremely important. Not just statically on the scales or on a flat surface, right, non-motion car, but very much so when the race car is on track, you know, when the dynamic changes of ride height are happening to the race car. The closer you are to the road surface, it just amplifies the importance of why it's important to understand what your ride height is. So an example, in my race car, again, it's all in pieces and parts this moment, I run extremely low ride height dimensions. I run it as close to the track surface as I can, trying to get that center of gravity as low as possible. I have the car pretty stiff in suspension, so not a lot of body roll, that type of thing. And I do that for my preference of the car performance, and my car seems to respond very, very well in doing so. My point of saying that is ride height, you know, the ability to measure ride height dynamically is critically important. When you're running a car that's extremely low to the track surface, you need the ability to actually log and measure that dynamically. Now, you could avoid doing that, and you could slowly back down the ride height of your race car to get it to a place where it seems to be performing. But you know, and then after a run, you inspect the bottom of your car, you see if you have any you know, any scruff marks, that kind of thing from road surface. You can do that. I've done that for years as well. So that is an option. But when you run extremely low to the track, you want to keep the car off the track surface if you can. Now, if you watch F1 as an example, you'll see them come out on track with a lot of sparks and that type of thing, and that's because they run so low and they use these titanium skid plates on the bottom of the race car. My race car, this particular one, does not have any surface that is intended to be a barrier between the race car and the track. You know, a lot of race cars will use Jabrock, which is a hardwood material for that purpose. But I run as low as I can, and I do not even put Jabrock on the bottom because that adds that extra, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 mils of floor dimension that I try to avoid. So hopefully that makes a little sense of why ride height is so important. Now again, on the scale, so statically, you can measure your ride height with just various different measuring devices, right? And that's pretty typical. In fact, let me pan down here and show you. So for an example, I have this, if you can see this bracket, right? This is well, here, let me show you on the car. This is just a bracket that actually I use. Doing this with one hand, so bear with me, I got it in the wrong side. This is one bracket, one jig that I made that actually sits on top of fixed mounting points on the A-arm itself, and it actually has this bar that protrudes down to the bottom. That's where I would measure there at the bottom, and I would do that while it's on the scale. So that's just one example. You'll need to find reference points on your race car that you can use repeatedly where the car's on the scales, again, flat surface, and you could measure your different ride height dimensions. Now, you're going to want to do that on each corner. So front left, right, rear left, right, that type of thing, and take those measurements. All right, so let me talk about dynamic ride height and sensors and how you may be able to measure ride height for your race car. Really, two options. One is to use position sensors on your dampeners, your shocks. Lots of cars do that. Street production cars even do that. And that is actually a pretty economical way to measure your ride height. Now, you need to keep in mind it's a calculation, it's an approximation. So what I'm referring to here, so here's an example of shock position sensors. It actually will measure the shock as it compresses and such. And with that, you're able to do a calculation on what your ride height is. Now, the motion ratio from your rockers and suspension movement from that shock to the ground road surface, it's not going to be one-to-one. So you'll have to do some measurements and calculations on exactly what your motion ratio is for that corner. And that would give you a calculation on ride height that you can use for your race car. Now, on the negative side, shock position sensors for ride height, one thing that is difficult to do, so your tires, as an example, are really nothing more than a spring. From a suspension point of view, tires themselves, if you think of them as a spring, they are pretty dynamic, right? When you first roll out on track, they're going to be cold. The circumference of the tire is going to be smaller, and your ride height will be smaller because the tires are cold, right? As your tires build 3-4 psi, get into the temperature range, the circumference will actually grow, and your ride height will actually increase at that point. So that's just one example. Now, of course, being a spring, the tires will actually move around quite a bit when they're heavily loaded, when they go over any type of bump of any type. They're going to move quite a bit. So calculating ride height with dampeners, while it does work, it's not extremely accurate. Okay. So what are the options? Well, the best way to measure ride height dynamically would be to have a laser sensor. And they've been out now for quite a while. And the benefits of laser sensors is you're going to have a very accurate understanding of where the bottom of your race car is at any moment of time on the racetrack. And typically these are mounted fixed to a fixed structure on your race car, so they don't have any movement. And so that's an important piece. And typically you're going to use 3 sensors. So unlike shock position sensors where you'll have 1 on each corner, right, each shock, laser sensors you only need 3, and you need 2 on one end of the race car and 1 on the other end. And lots of guys will do 2 up front and then 1 in the rear. If your race car gives you enough dimension, that is, on the front, width I'm referring to. So Formula race cars have a pretty narrow body in the front of the race car, and so what I do on mine, as an example, is I have 1 that's mounted up front, and then I have 2, one on each side of the rear of the race car, and that's how I get a little bit of body roll as well. That gives me a very clear, very strong understanding of ride height for my race car. And so I sample at about 100 hertz. It's a little overkill, so your sampling frequency, you'll have to think about that. But the benefits are very strong. If you absolutely want to know where your lower portion of the car is, your floor of your race car, to the track surface, laser sensors is the way to go. Now the negative, and here's one example, by the way. These are the sensors that I use. They're pretty straightforward, 12-volt supply. I think it's up to 18 or 19 volts in total, so they'll handle pretty much every car standard voltage. And these are a standard analog out, so a 0 to 5 volt analog signal. There are several others. I'll show you some other examples here in a minute. The negatives on laser sensors, it's going to be a little bit of a cost thing. You have typically the range of 400, 500, 600 up per sensor. So easily you could spend a couple $1,000s just in your laser sensors. Really 2 types though. As I showed you this one that I use, this is an analog output, which it's an economical sensor. I think these are in the $400 or $500 range. So price-wise, pretty attractive, pretty small, super easy to use. It's an analog output, so you'd have to calibrate the distance to analog like you would in any other sensor. But that's one example. So here's another example of a sensor. I have not used this one before. This is about $400. Another analog output. Again, here's the one that I was referring to. Now here's another one from Izzy Racing. They have some pretty great products, by the way. I haven't used this. I may go grab one of these for my race car for the front. Now let me explain the difference of these. It's a CAN-based messaging laser sensor. So, you know, analog, if you think about it, you can get noise on an analog signal. And any amount of noise, if you did have any noise, would actually, you know, affect your measurement, your reading, right? So with a CAN message, it's digital, and it communicates directly to your logger on a digital format. The negative with these, they're kind of pricey. I think they're about $2,000 a sensor, so they're not on the low end of the scale, but from more precision, I would say they're probably the ones to go with. So in my race car, you know, I talked about this a few different times, but I run very, very low to the racetrack. You know, on static scales, the front of my race car, as an example, I'm around 18 millimeters, kind of in that range. Again, pretty stiffly sprung car, which minimizes body roll, that type of thing. But I run so close to the track, for me, ride height is critical. If I want to keep the bottom of the car together and not tear it apart, I need to have a strong dynamic measurement. And so, again, I log at about 100 hertz laser ride height dimensions. And the second part I use, and I've talked about this before in a previous video, I use heave spring or third springs on the front. And here, let me get over to a side here where maybe you can see this okay. Again, the car's kind of tore apart here at the moment, but here's a third spring that I have mounted on the front of my race car. So I don't do this on the rear, just the front. Now, I use this third spring simply to help prevent and stop the race car from hitting the deck. If you have a large compression, some abrupt movement on the front of the race car, I use this for that purpose. I do not want my race car touching the deck. Now, I do not have springs in here, though I have one hard bumper, and this other bumper here, this blue one, actually, I forgot the softness scale on it, but it actually is compliant, so it actually will compress. It acts like a spring sort of to a degree. But I use the dimension here, this gap, as a measurement towards controlling the front of the race car from hitting the track surface. So this goes hand in hand with my ride height laser sensors. And again, I use a position sensor here to keep track and to monitor that as well. Hey, so things you'll want to think about in where you mount your laser sensors on your car. You're gonna want to keep them away from a heavy heat source if you can. Keep them away from direct sunlight, which typically is not a problem. You know, you'll mount these on the or facing on the bottom side of your floor typically, but the last point is, you know, this is a lens, so they all of them have a lens, a cover. You want to keep that clean. So at some frequency when you bring the car in, just give it a quick wipe and make sure you keep that clean, okay? So let me break away, let me get on the computer, and I'll bring up Motec, the i2 software, and I'll show you how I have a couple worksheets that I've created that I use to understand where my ride height is on the race car, both statically and then dynamically. So let's pan away. Let me show you what that looks like. Come on. Okay, so at this point, I have i2, the Motec analysis software, up and running. And I went to my chassis folder location that you can see here. And under chassis, I have multiple different workspaces, right? Worksheets, I think Motec calls it. So I'm in the ride height worksheet itself, and here I have a lot of data, so let me talk about this a little bit. Again, this is a focus around the vehicle's ride height itself. To the left of my screen here, if you can see my mouse move at all, there's a bunch of static settings here that are displayed, and the screen sizing here is a little odd, but let me explain these. So the top left, it's showing the spare third spring gap, and then I have static ride height, for the front and the rear, and I have the laser reading on the pads, so the kind of the static laser reading as well. Just to share that to the left. I'll come back here in the center in a minute, but to the right side of the display, if you can see that, I have 3 histograms. So the very top one is a histogram of the front laser ride height for this particular run, this session. And then the same goes true for the bottom. I have a left and right histogram. So it shows you the dimension or the height, the ride height across the entire run. So you can see where the readings are, you know, kind of in a typical fashion. It's just another view of data. So let me explain, though, this particular worksheet and why I have this. So you see at the top, I have speed, I have throttle, I have brake, gear position. I do that because in this example, I'm trying to understand under heavy braking, what does my ride height, more specifically front, but I'm looking at the rear here as well, what is my ride height under hard braking? And I do that because I know under extreme hard braking, running, you know, very, very low ride height itself, that I can come in contact with the road surface if I'm not careful. So that's what this is. And so as I look here to the top, again, where my cursor is, you can see speeds continuing to build. So I'm at the back of a long straightaway. And then the second row here, you'll see in purple is braking pressure, and just aligned there with it in kind of an orange color is the throttle. So I can see a braking event happen. And if I scroll forward, I can actually see my ride height change as I approach and as I apply braking. And so this first middle section here, where I have a bunch of red squiggly lines, right? If you watch this number where the mouse is and I scroll forward, you can see that ride height number change, right? In fact, if I back up here a bit, you can see it gets quite low. And you could argue it's touching the track surface at that point. So that's all this screen is, and it's useful from that point of view. Now, here in the middle under label that's called front ride height while braking, all that is, it's the same reading, but it's ultimately using a condition of braking pressure applied. Now, what is my front laser ride height at that point? So that's what that is. Now, if I roll over to another worksheet, this is called ride height. It's a track view, but ride height for the track itself. And this happens to be at COTA. The top left here, you can see dynamic readings of ride height. You can see the third spring gap. And then I plugged in a throttle and braking bar graphs just so you can see that, and speed and gyro roll, that kind of thing. But what's interesting, if I look here at the track, and if you can see the red dot as I click around on the racetrack. So this is down the back straight. You can see a bunch of red here. Now, actually, if I scroll over to the right, if you can see this map here, the different colors represent ride height, and specifically front ride height in this case. And so red is 0 or less than 0, which would mean I'm touching the road surface. And then it's a blended color from there all the way up to blue, which is, you know, greater than 1.5 inches, which is quite a lot. So just visually so you can see that. But I see a little bit of red here at the end of the straight. And this is before I start braking, so I have to look at that to see if I have any noise possibly in the signal itself. But past that, when I scroll a little bit further, you can see where this red dot is. You can see there's orange, and then you can see, to correlate with that, you can see braking pressure is applied. So orange means that it's about a tenth, 0.1 or 0.2 inches off the track surface, which is quite low, but it's not touching. So that's what that is. But anyway, visually, you get the idea. What I'm showing you here is you scroll around and just look at the track map. You can see different portions of the track where contact of the surface may be occurring. That's all this is used for. Again, I try to run extremely low, and I try to keep the floor of the race car off the racetrack surface if I can. Small touch here and there is not too big a deal, but that's what this is, okay? So the second worksheet that I'm going to show you here quickly is in my downforce folder section itself. Now, we're talking about ride height for this video, but I just wanted to show this and call it out. It's a relationship to downforce to a degree. So again, under the downforce folder, this is just one view that I have. If I scroll to the right up here, I'm going to select downforce ride height. And let me talk about these histograms a little bit. So let's focus on the left, the left side of the screen. The bottom, so this graph itself, the bottom x-axis is laser front ride height, okay? So all the way from 0 or -0, which would mean the chassis making contact with the road, up to about, I think, 1.5 inches or something that I have here. Then on the y-axis is downforce. And downforce on this race car, just for your reference, it's not a calculation, it's actually a measurement. So I have load cells on each corner. So each push rod of the race car has a load cell, and a load cell is a pretty accurate way to measure physical load on each corner. And so that's what this is. So the left, the y-axis on this splatter plot, sorry, not histogram, is actually showing you the load on the front of the race car by its ride height as well. So that's all this is, but it's giving you some level of just visual input that you can see the lower the ride height is. You can see the downforce actually increase. Okay. Now scrolling over to the right, just one here in the center of the screen. This is the rear of the race car. So on the bottom x-axis, similar to the front, I have laser rear ride height. Now this is an average between both left and right. And the y-axis is the load or downforce as well. So it's the same thing. Now this has an issue if you've pointed that out here. So you see here at 440 pounds of downforce, it goes flat. I just have load cells that need to be recalibrated. That's all it is. They have an error in their calibration. So that still gives you a curve of what it looks like. And so you can see as it compresses and ride height actually decreases, that the amount of downforce actually increases. So I just wanted to share this with you. It's another view that I do look at in ride height and in performance for the race car. You know, one last thing that comes to mind, ride height sensors. So using laser ride height sensors, very accurate, with load cells. Let me point to these. So here's an example of a load cell on a push rod for the suspension. That actually allows you to create very accurate aero maps three-dimensional aero maps for your race car. So I'm not going to get into that now or show you what I've done, but I'll do that on another video if you find that of interest. All right, well, ride height on race cars, talking about, you know, laser sensors and so on. I hope you found this of use and of interest. If you have any questions, thoughts, you know, comments, please send those over. I'll get back to you as quick as I can. I have a handful of items coming out on videos. I'm doing a full new body kit on the race car right this minute. More than that, actually, but the body kit's a big revision of the race car, so you'll see a video on that here in the next probably about 3-4 weeks roughly. A lot of work yet ahead of me on that. I do have a race coming up in about a month, so I'm head down getting ready for that race event, and so stay tuned to all of that. Now, if you haven't subscribed, hey, consider doing so. I would really appreciate that. And that's it for now, though. Until next time, okay? Ciao.